I'm Vicky Linnane and welcome to Embrace Therapy podcast. I am a practicing art therapist based in Ireland. In each episode, I will interview guests from various fields of therapy and well-being with the aim to encourage healing through embracing therapy. Hello and welcome to the Embrace Therapy podcast. It's a new year, 2022, and I'm very excited to get started with my latest guest, which is Liz Gleeson. Many of you would know Liz Gleeson from her own podcast called The Shapes of Grief. She has 80 wonderful episodes to date. Some of the topics include children's grief, widowhood, and how the LGBTQ have their own struggles within the grief and loss process. And it's just an unbelievable resource for any listener here, whether you're a social worker, a teacher, whatever background. It is a really informative resource to dive into, and I highly recommend that you go and check out Liz Gleeson's podcast. So not only is she a podcast host, she is a trailblazer in the field of grief and loss education, and she is currently a PhD student in the field of grief education. You can tell in this podcast just how passionate Liz is about the work that she does, and you know, she is so forthcoming with her own personal experiences, which really shows just how safe one would feel in her company. She's not afraid to be vulnerable in the space with me, and I imagine she'd be very supportive for anyone going to her in a one-to-one therapeutic way. She offers one-to-one therapeutic support for those going through grief of any kind from her private practice in Greystones and online. And Liz is the curator of the Shapes of Grief global grief education program. You can check out her website for more, which is shapesofgrief.com. It's a real pleasure to have her on the podcast. As a fellow creative arts therapist, I have a lot of curiosity around how she supports people and when she decides to put on the Dramatherapist hat in her work and use those tools and techniques that she learned back when she was doing it in 2004. Liz's approach is well grounded in theory and practice, and she has a real interest in a somatic approach to supporting the grieving process, which we talk about a little bit in this interview. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Liz Gleeson.
I work as a grief therapist in private practice, and I absolutely love my work. It's so unique, I think, to be able to step out of work at the end of the day and say that was so meaningful, that made a difference. My life, my work has purpose, you know. It's a really, I'm sure a lot of our creative arts therapists feel similar. The podcast has completely taken off, which is lovely. What really matters is it's making a difference to people. Like, I'm hearing a lot of therapists say they love it and it's educational. Bereaved people are saying it's given me hope. I'm learning about my grief. And it's helping to spread the conversation about grief. And then I also developed the grief education program on shapesofgrief.com. And that's, you know, being really well received as well. It's slowly getting out there, but anyone who's doing it is loving it. And at the same time, I was offered a scholarship to do a PhD to actually measure, you know, people's encounter with the program. What did they know about grief beforehand? When I say people, I mean mental health professionals, really, or healthcare professionals. What do they know about grief? Did they think they understood grief? Have them take the program and then re-interview them as to what were their actual competencies versus their perceived competencies. A lot of seasoned therapists really think they understand grief, and many of them do, and many of them don't. So trying to put some figure and shape on that.
Oh, I'm so excited about that. I am so excited about that. Oh my goodness. That sounds amazing. Because I just think when we can measure these things, like how rich is that for us, you know, for the people that are coming after us as well. That's just, wow, like what a brilliant resource that will be.
I did a brief little study with members of IAHIP. It was a few years ago now, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, and I was giving a CPD to psychotherapists and supervisors on grief in clinical practice. And there was only 14 in the workshop. And at the beginning of the day, I said, okay, raise your hand if you advertise bereavement as, one of the things you support in practice. And of course, everybody raised their hand. And then I asked them, have you ever heard of the dual process model or continuing bonds or meaning making, and nobody had. So we went through our day. And then at the end of the day, it was like, how do you feel now about saying you support bereaved people? And out of the 14, 2, had a relatively good training in grief in their undergraduate training or their psychotherapy training. But the other 12 were like, I actually hadn't a clue. And what's scary is I thought I did, so hopefully the PhD research will just put a bit more cement behind these theories I have.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
make people think differently.
Yeah. Oh, I honestly, I'm so like goosebumps thinking about that. It's just so exciting. And I suppose, are you passionate about the research part as well? Because, you're very busy, you've got a lot of things going on, but is this something that you're also just like, can't wait to get into? Or are you like, oh, about it?
No, I love it. I
Yeah.
absolutely love it. I love reading. I love learning. To me, it's so relevant. Like grief to me is not some arbitrary concept that I'm researching. I live it every single day,
Yes.
we all live it every single day to some degree.
Mhm.
On the most extreme, I've just spent Saturday distributing my father's belongings from his home, after he died a few months ago, to the unanswered text from someone you like, or we're all living loss every single day. So for me, I just love it. I just love learning about humanity, what makes us tick, and it makes me feel more secure in the world to have this psychoeducation. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Liz. A month on, it's very new, so I won't be going there too much with you, but I appreciate you for mentioning it. I think
Actually, it's 8 months on,
oh,
and
8 months. Oh, sorry.
I'm completely fine to talk about it, actually.
Oh, wow.
So this is what we're trying to change, is like, let's
Yeah.
not skirt around loss,
Mm,
What's the worst thing that could happen? I
yeah.
get upset and cry, and that's not a bad thing.
Mm,
This is what we're trying to change, really,
yeah.
with the whole shapes of grief.
Yeah.
Is for people to feel a bit more confident to say, is it okay to go there? Can I
Mm,
ask you about your dad's death?
yeah, absolutely.
And some people will say no, and most will go, I'd love to talk about it, because
Mm,
most people don't want to. So
yeah. I always feel like that, like when I'm with somebody, in the therapy space, I don't like overshare, but if I feel there's a need for me to kind of say, I've experienced grief to a certain degree, the same. Like, I think there's something about being human in that moment. Like, and like for me, like I've lost my brother, and I suppose that's always been my day in, day out grief. Um, and I suppose there's, generational stuff there as well that I carry every day. But, you know, I just think when you said that, part of me just connected with you as well. And then like it's that ripple effect. I think
yeah.
our listeners as well will get that feeling too. But I suppose rather than skirting around it, just acknowledging that, you're in that process now, and it doesn't stop, that continues. And that's what your work is showing us as well, is that, our grief doesn't go anywhere,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you've touched on two really important things here, Vicky. You were talking about when someone brings up grief in the therapy room, which I hope for most therapists listening, their clients are bringing up grief, because so much is about loss, even though there may not be a death involved. But you said about being human and saying, oh yeah, I understand grief. Like, it's really, really important, when we're supporting people who are bereaved, it's not the same as when someone comes in saying, I want to figure out my life path or my career, or, it really requires a huge depth of humanity from us as therapists. and kindness. We have somebody sitting in front of us who, I use metaphors all the time because there isn't language really, but it's like the skin is ripped from us, or it's like, I'm talking about maybe a shocking loss, or a very profound loss for somebody, or a very meaningful loss for somebody. They've such a level of vulnerability, and we have to meet that with kindness, with compassion, with humanity. It's so, so vital. And I was giving a CPD to some GPs recently, and one of them said, gosh, I never know what to do. When somebody says someone's died, and I feel like maybe tears coming up behind my eyes, and I'm trying to maintain that professional boundary, and what should I do? And I just said to her, like, God, let yourself be human. Actually, if you feel moved by someone else's loss and they see that reflected in your face, that's such a balm to know that someone else is connecting right now with my pain and empathizing at such a deep level. I mean, obviously, we're not going to burst out crying and start telling our story, but yeah, humanity is vital.
Mm-hmm.
And then just briefly, Vicky, the other thing you talked about, you said your brother died, and I'm sorry, what was his name?
Gary.
Gary.
Yeah.
I mean, you're young, so
Mm-hmm.
I assume Gary was also young.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can assume it was an untimely death,
Oh yeah,
which is,
definitely.
I don't want to make too many assumptions about your experience there, but I can imagine Gary's death has profoundly changed your family or you in the world.
Absolutely. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not the same person. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, my father was, and this is for me, this is not across the board.
Mm-hmm.
For me, my father was, I was really accepting of his death. He was 92. He had a really good life. He was sick for about 5 years. I was so prepared for it. I had anticipated it 100 times. I
Yeah.
had said to myself almost, 3 times a week for 5 years. I wonder, will this be the last time I see him? I wonder, were they my last words? Like,
Oh.
I was so prepared for his death.
Mm.
And it does make a difference. And it doesn't mean that I don't feel the grief, but it's not dysregulating for me.
Yeah.
It's not shocking. It has not profoundly changed who I am in the world.
Mm.
Things in my life have, but this one hasn't. And, that's where we have to be really careful that we don't take our experience of grief, for example, your personal experience with Gary,
Yeah.
and make it a universal experience.
Yeah.
Like in the way that you said, oh, it's only been a month, we'll go careful with you, Liz. Like, no, my experience is really different.
Mm.
And sometimes a lot of grief gurus are there because they've lost someone they love. But the danger of that is they're taking their grief experience, a
Mm.
personal experience, and making it universal.
Yeah.
And it's not like that. We have this whole spectrum from trauma, shock, devastation, to acceptance, gratitude,
Mm.
and love from the beginning, and everything in between.
And I suppose just following on from, so feeling the bereavement, and then as a person we can then, I suppose, react in different ways to that loss. So I know that there's that avoidance part where you've mentioned it before already, that like, a part of us wants to skirt away, whether it's our Irishness to kind of not get too deep with somebody or something. I don't know what it is, but that avoidance piece, and then that dysregulated piece that you were saying as well, I suppose they're kind of linked in that way. But how other ways might we show that we're going through that process? But I suppose avoidance is definitely one, but how else would you recognize it, just for our listeners?
How would we recognize that someone is going through the grieving process?
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh
like,
gosh, again, a whole spectrum
mm,
there. Um, from the most extreme, like when I am supporting people who've been through a traumatic loss,
mhm,
and generally that's what I do see in practice. Just briefly, the research tells us that 100% of bereaved people, or people experiencing a significant loss, And I would throw divorce, separation, miscarriage, all of these things in there as well, pet loss. What we know from the research, George Bonanno mostly, is that 100% of people need comfort, friendship, community, information, and just, you know, those sort of community rites of passage or rituals or ceremonies that holds us. And we all need that. But only 60% of people, 60% of people will be okay with that. They'll integrate their loss. That's all they will need. Their loss will still be there. It'll still be painful, but they will learn to live with it with the help of people around. And it can often be really painful because sometimes there aren't people around. Very often there aren't people around, or we experience that. So 40% of people will need something else. They will need maybe a group for other people who've had a miscarriage, or they may need to find a group for sibling loss, because there's certain themes that come with losing a sibling that don't come with other losses, such as, Vicky, how are your parents? As opposed to, Vicky, how are you? You're nodding.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You know, so for siblings, they may want to meet other people who are having this similar experience. And so a lot of people can find great comfort and support, you know, in a group. My last podcast guest, Rach Underhill, her wife died just coming up to 2 years ago, and she wanted to find an LGBT specific group, so she doesn't have to be coming out and then explaining all different ways that being gay may affect being, you know, your bereavement. So this is really important to people, to find other people in similar positions to them. And then we also know that certain people within that 40% or that 30% will need the help of a counsellor and psychotherapist. But there is an assumption that a counsellor or a psychotherapist will know how to be with grief or deep loss. And many of us don't, which is why I created the program. And then 10% of people will need help for prolonged grief disorder. And that's where over time the grief does not integrate, and don't accommodate it in our lives. And our lives are very, very affected as a result, which is different to we're changed as a result. We tend to be stuck in some ways. Yeah. So back to your question, what do I recognize? It's not the bottom of the pyramid, if you like, and I'm quoting the Irish Hospice Foundation pyramid here. It's not the bottom of the pyramid people that I see. It's the ones further up, you know, the 30%, the 10%, who it's like, and apologies to listeners, I use this metaphor all the time, but it's like someone has taken a sledgehammer to your nervous system, and you just don't know how to turn it off or what help you need. So the way I recognize that is very physical, actually. I'm trained, I'm an open floor teacher and therapist, which is like, it's not dance movement therapy. It doesn't have the same degree of training, but I would have learned a lot about the body and, you know, the working from a bottom up approach. The theories of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, Bessel van der Kolk's work, Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, Pat Ogden, like all of this I would have studied over the years. So when someone comes into me, I see it in tense body, hunched shoulders, very shallow breathing, really dilated pupils, a look of panic in their face, or a look of just utter, just like the switch has just been turned off. So we know this like from the polyvagal theory, that people are either in that fight or flight state, or they've fallen down into that collapsed dorsal vagal zone. And what's really important is to acknowledge first the depth of the loss, and to acknowledge what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing how shook up you are. I see this in your body. And to say specifically maybe where I see it. So to acknowledge the depth of the loss, and, you know, over time, over the first few sessions, but to acknowledge the role that I have in the room. So the prosody of my voice. Am I breathing deeply? am I regulated? Because my compassionate, regulated, steady presence will do wonders for that dysregulated body. But if I'm all wound up and dysregulated and I don't really know how to work with this, I'm just contributing to a problem, you know. Yeah, I hope that answers
Oh,
your
it's absolutely. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much. Um, you know, it's November now as we're doing this recording, but you know, it's not too far away till Christmas. And I suppose for a lot of people, November in Ireland, we kind of think about those that we've lost. There's remembrances, you know, All Souls Day and everything. So there's a lot of this almost reconnecting with grief, and then coming into Christmas, which can bring up a whole lot of grief for so many families. And like that again, it's that spectrum of grief. It can be the neighbor around the corner has COVID, she can't come this year. You know, it can be something small like that this year. That it's not small, but it's you know, in comparison to someone who's like a granddad who's not at the table this year, you know. But I suppose just to acknowledge that this is a difficult time of year for people, and this conversation might be just triggering a lot for people too. But is there anything, I suppose, Liz, coming from your background especially, that you can say to people that are going through this process now and kind of dreading Christmas, you know, because of this? Yeah.
It's just so true. I mean, loss is so painful, and Christmas for so many people is so painful. Um, you know, you are blessed if you are a family that have not experienced loss, you know, truly blessed, you know, particularly with so many grandparents that have died in the last 18 months. Many people will be missing someone or someone's at their table this year, either because of restrictions or not. You know, it can be a painful time, but from my experience personally and also in practice is the anticipation of Christmas is where the pain is.
Mm-hmm.
The day is fine. It's just another day that you're missing someone. But it's the work, it's the building up to it, it's the anticipation of it. And I often say to people, just bring that bar right down. Can you have a good enough day? If there's children there, can it just be about them? Can I accept simply that I'm going to feel sad?
Mm-hmm.
Accept I'm triggered. I feel sad. This is painful. I think we need to just face into it. It's when we don't, when we say, I have to put on a show for the kids, or I have to put on a show this Christmas, or like jolly my way through it. That sort of approach can cause immense suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I do say to people, spread it out. Like if there's an anniversary or a birthday or Christmas, spread it out. Acknowledge your loss 2 weeks before Christmas. Go to the grave, you know, have your glass of sherry, or do something with your loved one who has died. You know, don't leave it all into this one day. But, you know, anyone who's experiencing profound loss, they're experiencing it every day. Christmas is often just another day, you know. It's when we begin to maybe heal and integrate that the wound gets opened up again, or the volume goes up on our grief around Christmas time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just you know, that's there's no profound words of wisdom except Christmas can be really painful. You know, I'm coming up to my 7th Christmas now since being separated, and you know, my family of 6 is now a family of 5. And although it was something that I wanted and something I sought and something that I'm glad happened, there's always someone missing at our Christmas table.
Mm-hmm.
My kid's dad is always missing from our Christmas table. And we all feel that acutely, you know, that the shape has changed. And the first 2 years, certainly, or 3 years, were really painful, but mostly because I was trying to put on a superb Christmas display, you know, to mitigate this disaster. We probably would have been better off just sitting down going, this sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Really miss them today, you know. But, you know, a client of mine put it beautifully once. I bumped into her in Woody's, and it was maybe 2 years after we'd finished working together, um, or 2 years after her daughter had died, actually. And I asked her, how are you doing at the moment? Like, how, you know, how is it for you now? And she thought about it for a minute, and then she looked at me and she said, it's like there's little bubbles of life beginning to return. And
Hmm.
I thought that was just such a beautiful metaphor, where it's like there's just no aliveness or joy often in the aftermath of a loss. But those bubbles of life do come back. And Christmas, we've got used to him not being here. Actually, he's joining us this year, which is really nice. We'll be the 6th again for the day. But slowly bubbles of life did start to come back. Slowly was like, yeah, I want the Christmas tree, as opposed to I have to do the Christmas tree, you
Yes.
know, and the excitement became genuine again rather than forced. So your day will come again. Yeah, maybe Christmases will never be the same, life will never be the same, but it doesn't mean you can't experience moments of joy, moments of content, moments of happiness within that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful metaphor, really, that aliveness inside, like that bubbling
Bubbles
up.
of life, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Um, and you've kind of just touched on it a little bit there, the joy sometimes, like sometimes when people are, you know, in bereavement, they feel like they can't laugh and they can't be happy. And especially with children, you know, last week was Children's Bereavement Week, or Bereaved Children's Week. I always get it wrong. But just, I suppose, having a conversation with Jacinta Smiles for IACAT, it was lovely linking in with her. And I suppose just noticing that children do also go through bereavement just like us. And it's okay for them to play and be joyful and have laughter. That you can have grief underneath everything, you know, you still have to be human, you know. So I just love, I suppose, having these conversations and just making it a little bit more normal for people to hear that, you know, we can live our lives and have pockets of joy and pockets of sadness, and you know, that's part of the grieving process. Would you see children, actually, Liz? Would that be part of your work?
Yeah, it's funny. I resisted it for a long time because I had 4 kids under the age of 4.
Ooh.
And I was like, okay, I can barely cope with my own, never mind support someone else's. But um, and I really love to do depth work, you know, so I avoided working with children for quite a while, but every now and again I'll get a call and someone will say, look, there's someone who's stuck, and you know, it's beautiful to work with children. And I have worked with children, and often it ends up being very creative.
Yeah.
And I know we're probably going to get to this in this podcast, but yeah, it often involves my animals and a lot of creativity. So I've brought pet rats into the therapy room. My dog is almost always there if there is a child present. Um, and not so much the cat, because she picks and chooses where she. Yeah, I have this beautiful lurcher who's the most gentle thing, you know, she's like a soul on legs, you know, she's so
Yes.
soulful, and she's just so gentle. And so children will, I find, you know, they will talk about, you know, maybe their mom in the coffin, and then turn to the dog for regulation, talk again about something to do with the death, and then turn to the dog for regulation, or turn to art for regulation. So this is very normal, and kind of touches on what you were just saying there about dosing our grief.
Hmm.
You know, we are full of loads of emotions at the same time. We can, and grief is very paradoxical. We can feel so many different things, like, I'm so glad my baby was born and I'm a mum now, and I'm devastated that my baby didn't survive. And we can have these seemingly conflicting emotions, but no, they're absolutely true. When someone gives birth to a baby and maybe that baby is stillborn, one of the first things we say is, congratulations on the birth of your baby. She
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And you often see the mothers just, they've still given birth, they still have a baby, they've still become a mother, this is still their child. That, you know, they're often so proud of their baby and so careful of with their baby, as any mother would be. And we tend to forget this. When the baby dies, we just see the death as opposed to everything else that comes with it. So the same with grief. You know, it's not like, okay, here's a brick and now you are just grieving until you're not. We dance in and out of it. You know, this is the dual process model of Strobe and Schutt. We confront our grief, we feel our grief, we're consumed by our grief, and then we take a break from it and we make dinner, have a laugh with friends, go to the cinema until the grief hits again. And we often see this oscillation, you know, back and forth between grief orientation and restoration orientation. And that's normal. We're not in grief all the time. So you might see someone at a funeral and their child has died and they're standing talking to someone and laughing.
Mm-hmm.
This judgment about that, like, oh my God, how could they be like that? But what you don't know is that 2 hours previously, they had just spent 28 hours under the duvet wailing to the sky, you know.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand this, that what you see in a moment is simply what you're seeing in a moment. It's not a reflection of the current state, you know. It's just that moment in time. And the grief is often under there. It's always under there. It's
Mm.
just a question of it, are they in the middle of confronting it or not, unconsciously?
Yeah, yeah, that's so lovely. Yeah, and it is so funny. Like I can even remember being at, like, in my house, we would have always been going to funerals. Like, it's something, I suppose my family are from the west of Ireland, and family rituals are, the wake, everything is, it's so part of who we are. It's our, family tradition. We always have the wake, and yeah, like I suppose since I was born, I've just been part of that process. I've been present, and part of it, never excluded, never on the fringes, completely part of death. I remember my first experience of it really was probably my grandmother on my dad's side, and him lifted me up and giving her a kiss and saying how beautiful she looked in the coffin. And I just, I thank him, for all of those, because they're very important to me now, because I'm okay to sit with someone who's passed on. I'm okay to touch, I'm okay to be with someone. And my work in a nursing home before helped me with that as well. Like, it's all part of it. But a lot of people aren't okay with that. A lot of people don't want to see children at funerals. A lot of people are like, how can she be laughing? Yeah. So there's this judge, and that always comes in. I think, you can kind of hear it in whispers sometimes at funerals, how is the children here? They should be kept away from it, but really, my opinion is be part of it. Otherwise you're not going to really be part of the grieving process either, so yeah.
100%. I mean, if you want to ask, like, how are kids around death and grief, or how do we cope, you start them early. Make this part of life. Absolutely. Like, it's lovely what you're describing.
Yeah.
We never force a child. If a child doesn't want to kiss granny, we're not
Yes.
going to make them.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
you know we can
Yeah.
make it accessible and easy. And I remember my son, Oshin, he's 14, and I had said to him, come and see granddad, and we're going to the funeral home, and come and see granddad. And my daughter was there as well, she's 16, and Leah was just like, I do not want to see him. I don't need to see that. I don't need that memory. I don't want to see him. And I did try and coax her, but there was no coaxing to be had. And Oshin just said no. But then he saw me and he knew I was upset looking at dad in the coffin, and he knew I was crying. And he's so good, like, he's such a compassionate kid. He came over, even though he didn't want to, for me.
Mm.
And we just stood there, together, and looked at my dad. And I was sort of describing the suit and the tie, and look at this. And I said, what do you think? That he was seeing his first dead person. And he just looked for a minute and he said, well, he looks a lot better than he did last week. and
So
that's the
true.
truth. He
Yeah.
looked
Yeah.
a lot better in death. But
Yeah.
yeah, so, you know, 3 of my kids have had, you know, I have twins who are 11. They've had their godmother has died. Their grandfather has died. They've, for whatever reason, they've seen more people who are dead than my older ones have. And it's kind of normal and they're not scared. And it means when I come to die, they've had, it's not the first experience for them.
Yeah.
You know, we need to show kids their dead pets and dead wildlife and dead trees, and just understand the cyclical nature of life. It makes death much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many, I suppose, threads that I'm looking at and I'm thinking of pulling which one, but I suppose maybe just getting into that creative part, you know, because as an art therapist, I'm really curious how you bring that into your work. You've brought in how you sit with somebody's body and you can feel their body and recognize what's happening and maybe reflect that back to them. And then you mentioned how you bring in animals for co-regulation. But when you're using the art or maybe story or something like that, how do you find that helps? Like, can you walk us through maybe something that you've done before that has helped?
Yeah, God, there's just so much, isn't there? And I don't know if I'm going to have sort of a defined narrative on this,
Oh,
but
that's okay.
I'll pull on some little things. I think it's really important to know what's happening us physically when we are grieving or we've had a traumatic loss. And, you know, when we have that stress response, which is essentially what it is in the body, we have this cocktail of hormones that are secreted, adrenaline and cortisol, that put us into the fight or flight mode. So we're out of our comfort zone. We're out of our window of tolerance, is what it's called. And we're in this fight or flight mode. So physically, our body is gearing up to either fight or run. And there's a huge amount of physiological changes that happen. And one of those changes is the blood is sort of pumped to the extremities, the arms and the legs, to enable us to get away from the situation, even though it's an emotional situation rather than a physical threat. But we haven't evolved yet to be able to distinguish that. So we respond physically as if it's a physical threat when we're emotionally threatened or emotionally dysregulated. So part of the blood moving to the extremities is, and then the amygdala at the back of the brain there, are sort of, I think it's the reptilian brain, swells, and then oxygen to the front of our brain is diminished. So with less blood at the front of the brain and less oxygen to the front of the brain, our ability to sit down and process and talk and explain and make sense of is completely compromised. It's a bit like menopause in that way. No, I'm being facetious, making jokes now, but our ability, there's certain times of our life where our brain just doesn't work and it's not our fault. And grief is one of those times. But the ability to recall, to make decisions, to plan, to articulate clearly is severely compromised. Yet we are having this profoundly distressing physical experience often, where we can't sleep, we can't make sense of our experience, we're feeling often terrified. You know, that famous quote from C.S. Lewis, nobody ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. Like our anxiety levels can rise, we become hyper vigilant, everybody can become a threat. Like if you're not safely here beside me with a warm voice and a warm hand in my back, I don't want you near me. You know, so this is why relationships can really suffer at times of grief. When you have a bunch of dysregulated people, and then the mirror neurons and everybody's picking up each other's hypervigilance and they think me, and you know, you're nodding.
Yes. Yeah.
So back to the art therapy then in the clinic, when we take all of this into consideration, someone's not going to sit down and tell me their story, probably, or they may, spit it out really quickly in a state of distress.
Yeah.
So paint and paper, crayons and paper, markers, immediately we're calling people to enter their ventral vagal state. Let's go into a different part of the brain. Let's start expressing this on paper. So we're engaging another part. It's a little bit like when someone's getting re-traumatized. We might say, can you count backwards in French from 20? And they're like, what? These stuff, these weed, these set. And then it's like, how are you doing now? And it's like, oh, I'm settled. I'm okay. Sometimes it is about sort of gently bringing the brain somewhere else, or find 5 green things in the room. We're taking them off that trauma highway and we're bringing them into a more gentle back road, if you like, to simplify the neuroscience. And in that gentle back road is the painting. It's like bringing them from that sympathetic stress response into the ventral vagal social engagement response. So anything that brings us into our flow state is just so good for our bodies. Breathing, singing, storytelling, creating, painting, petting a dog. That's one way the creative arts therapies can really help, when they can help us literally change our nervous system response in a moment, and help us to feel settled and help us to feel regulated. Another way is, I'm having this experience and I just can't find the words. I haven't learned the words yet for dysregulation, hypervigilant, activated. I'm in my dorsal vagal. Like, we don't have that language when we're Joe self. So we don't have the narrative to explain what's going on for us. So the creative arts can be a really good way. Like, nearly everyone I speak with speaks in symbol or metaphor. When they're talking about how they feel, it's like a bomb went off inside me and there's fragments of me everywhere and I can't find them. I can't find those parts of me. Or it's like a tsunami has hit me and I'm drowning. Or it's like a truckload of grief has just landed on me. All these beautiful metaphors. So, the potential of healing with metaphor as well, meeting grief with symbol and metaphor. What's created then in the process can give expression where there are no words, or we can't access the words, or we can begin to find a narrative through the creative process.
Yeah.
It gives containment for our experience as well. Something that feels so big that I can't contain it in my body can be contained perhaps in a piece of art.
And even just that, that container, that can do so much for someone, just get it all out on the page, and then just decide to just maybe even scrunch it up into a ball and throw it in the bin. That can be such an act, of release for someone who's going through so much and it's feeling heavy, or they've been hit by a bus, or, those kind of things that you've mentioned. And I suppose I've different levels of experience with grief coming up. Just like you said, everybody has different types of grief. And recently I joined about a year ago, actually, Full Circle Playback Theatre, and I just adore it because you can pretty much guarantee that every performance that you do, grief is going to come up. It's interesting in some way that it is a story that we all have and we all share and we connect with it. So in Playback Theatre, we have a storyteller, and we've actors and a conductor then. So the storyteller is often just in the audience, a member of the public, and now it's on Zoom for us for the last year. We've been doing performances on Zoom and it's been amazing. Just having that connection with people and people getting that opportunity to tell their story and for us to play it back to them. Just like in that art that we've mentioned, you know, there's that reflective piece of seeing it again, or something that was missing and you're seeing it there in that piece of paper. You're like, wow, I didn't see that before until now. And in playback, it's alive. It's in that moment, and it's so visceral as well. So, and I know you've experienced with it, so I'd love to hear how you have found playback theatre to be for you.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I loved it. Like when I did my drama therapy training, I think it was 18 years ago, so nearly 2 decades ago. Playback we did, it was a guy, John Powell, I think was his name, or something like that. He came over from the UK and taught us, and I loved that module. And after we graduated, I set up a playback group for, it was about 6 of us in it. And originally we were just like, we were all drama therapy students. And then I think a few of our tutors joined in as well.
Lovely.
So we named ourselves Cree Playback Theatre, which Cree means heart in Irish. And yeah, we used to meet weekly in each other's houses, and we also had rehearsal space. And we were all working in, like, one of us was working in the prisons, one was working in the addiction services. At the time I was working or offering drama therapy in a nursing home, so with older people. And so we used to go and do performances in all of these venues for free. Obviously, it was like a hobby with a lot of altruism, I guess, in it, and we loved doing it. And we had Cree Playback Theatre for about 4 years, and then one of our members got terminal cancer. Anna is a drama therapist, and she worked in the addiction services. And you know, we were the group, like, although, you know, some in the group were very, very close to Anna, I wouldn't have been as close to her emotionally, but ended up playing a really pivotal part of her illness and death, possibly because you know, we weren't best friends. So I was actually able to show up for her and give her what she needed, as opposed to be drowning in my own loss. But it's relevant to playback theatre because our very last performance as a group was to Anna in the hospice in Rathmines. And Anna was there, and she had all her tubes, and you know, she was at the end stages really of cancer, and she asked us to come in, and I was the conductor. That's the role that I used to do in our playback theatre group. And we played back Anna's life to her. And actually Angela Bracken was there. She was our director of studies at the time. And we invited Angela to come as well. And it was just amazing. And I remember Anna sort of pulling me over beside her and saying, Liz, this is where it's at. You know, this is where it's at. And, you know, I'd been thinking of the depth of that work and the beauty of that work. But I think that's where a seed, like, I think there was several seeds planted for me about working in grief, but one of them came from that. I realized with Anna that I was really able to show up. I was really able to show up to her illness, to her suffering, to her dying. And I realized that there was a gift in that I wasn't scared of it, or I didn't fear it. And actually I made videos. I helped her make videos for her children, for her mother. It was a really privileged position to be in. So that playback's amazing. Sorry, that's just a
so beautiful
story.
Yeah.
It's an amazing process, and I've trained with Jonathan Fox and Joe Salas in the States and in the UK, and yeah, I hope full circle, you've been going for ages, so enjoy that and keep it going. My good friend Sheila is in that group.
Yeah, oh, Sheila's amazing. I just adore it, and I don't think I'm ever going to stop. You know, it's part of my self-care and my personal development. It's just it clears the wheel, but also fills my cup at the same time. It's just gorgeous. Yeah, I really love the work. But it's that getting into the body again and finding that expression, and not always leading on words, because sometimes there are no words, like we've said. Yeah.
The more I work, Vicky, the more I go, we've got it so wrong. Like, we put so much emphasis on thought and cognitive ability, and everything is in the body, everything. I think our brains are like TVs. The verbal part of our brain, it's like a TV channel, and you could just tune into any old rubbish on any given day.
Yeah.
And we just, as we're thinking it, we think it's true, or we create our own dramas, our own TV dramas in the TV of our brain. And it's like, what does your body say? Because that's a true experience, and feelings are held in the body. What are feelings? They're essentially a set of sensations that we put a meaning on. So if anxiety is actually a beating heart, a dysregulated nervous system, a hypervigilant self, we need to be meeting anxiety with, a settled nervous system, somebody who's present, safety, and psychoeducation, like telling people, you are like our English language, where we have to be is just one verb. We say you are anxious and you are Vicky. Like in Spanish, there's two verbs for that. You are Vicky is never going to change, and that uses one verb. And then estar, is the other way of saying right now in this moment I am.
Yeah.
But then even to take it further, they don't say I am fear, they say I have fear. Yeah. And the same with Irish, in the Irish language, it's like an emotion comes in, visits us and leaves, and their language reflects that. In English language, like, we just let it consume us. I am scared, I am anxious, and we own it like that.
Yeah, I love that about the Irish language, though. It's like what is it? The sadness of the world is upon me, like things like that. It's on you, but it can, you're going to move through it, or it's not you.
Grown on thou and
yeah, yeah. I love that. Yeah,
it's dramatic.
The dramatics of it. Yeah, exactly. But it's that metaphor again, isn't it? That weight that you can feel. Yeah. So
I actually went walking with someone the other day. The National Maternity Hospital often refers people to me. And what I find is a lot of women, when their baby has died, or they've experienced a miscarriage, they're really mistrusting their bodies, or blaming their bodies, or dissociating from their bodies through the experience. So I've started to suggest from the beginning, can we walk? How would that be? Walk and talk. And it's just great. But I was walking with someone the other day and drawing on metaphors from the natural world. Yeah. And there was a big concrete slab in front of us. And I was like, imagine we pick this up. Now you bend over there and imagine this on your back. That's what it feels like. And, in time that will chisel away. But more importantly, your back will get stronger. Your legs will get stronger. And you'll learn to carry this with more ease. So in a way, it's like that, what you were about to say there, the metaphor of the world on the back. Yeah. That is what it feels like. There's something happening to me that's just too big for me to carry right now. We have to help people to make space for that.
Yeah.
Physically, emotionally, and cognitively.
And as a community, making space for it as well, making space for these conversations. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Liz, having you on. It's just incredible. And I suppose I want to say congratulations on the Social Entrepreneur Ireland Award, and you deserve it so much. And I just want everyone to go check out Shapes of Grief podcast and your grief work as well on your website. The resources there are just amazing. And the education part of it for anyone in healthcare, absolutely. Anyone with an interest, just go for it, really.
I've purposely priced it so that it's as affordable as possible to as many people as possible. And the feedback has been incredible. Like, it is really good targeted grief education for healthcare practitioners. So do go over and subscribe. You do it in your own time, take as long as you want. Yeah, and some really amazing speakers are in there.
Oh, when I saw Dr. Irvin Yalom, I was like, oh my goodness. He's just like, oh, he's just a beautiful person as well.
It's really important to say, the funny thing is, Dr. Irvin Yalom is there as a person who is grieving, actually. It's
Yeah.
a case study. And although we all have him on this pedestal as this amazing psychotherapist and this amazing human, which he is, he didn't understand grief until his wife died. And that's really important to say, that after 60 decades or 70 decades of working in mental health as a psychotherapist, he talks about, in one of his books, he describes the story of a fellow professor whose husband had died, and he was supporting her through this loss. And at one stage, she just looked at him and she said, "You haven't a clue. You sit there in your suit and your pink striped shirt, and you really don't understand what I'm going through." And his argument was, "Oh, do I have to have experienced grief to be able to support you in grief? You know, do I have to have schizophrenia to be able to support you through schizophrenia?" But he said, when I met him, when Marilyn died, his wife, he suddenly understood what she meant. And he said, "Yeah, I hadn't a clue."
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I have a feeling that was in his book, Becoming Myself. I'm not too sure if it was that one, but I think it was. I recently got that on Audible, and just listening to him read it to me at night is just gorgeous, you know. I love that. But yeah, everybody should check you out on Facebook and Instagram. It's Shapes of Grief. Is that what it would be on both? Perfect.
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, shapesofgrief.com or at Shapes of Grief. Thanks so much for having me on, Vicky. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. All the best with the work.